On the topic of passing screening rounds with high-performing companies, I'd like to share with you some advice based on my interactions with many thousands of candidates. The first thing is I do agree that phone screening rounds are impression-based hiring at its best. Okay, so you could get lucky, you could make a strong impression that will matter a lot more when compared to your actual expertise. Okay, especially if you have that expertise but you cannot communicate it during the job interview. Also, there's many candidates that have the core reason of a perfectly keyworded CV as the recruiter or the interviewer to take the risk of passing them or advancing them to a final interview round. And last but not least, it's also extremely common for candidates to pass screening rounds simply because they had referrals or because they are great networkers. Okay, these are tried and tested methods to pass phone screening rounds. I would argue this is maybe a third of what actually happens during these screening rounds. So the other 2/3 would likely pass based on other criteria that I would also like to touch upon next. Okay, so the first scenario I'd like to share with you is that of a candidate who is over-preparing a phone screening round. Okay, so in other words, you pay Dan Kreuter 3 coaching sessions, you pay me $1,000 to prepare a phone screening round, and then only to find out that, hey, you're not even a good fit for that role. Okay, so a reactive person would say, hey, you know what, I spent all this money only to find out I'm not even a fit for the role. Right? Now, in my experience, what happens in this case is when you make a good impression in that job interview, even though you're not a great fit, after some time, after a few weeks or even months in some cases, they will call you back to invite you for another screening round with an appropriate role for which you might be an even better fit. This happens extremely often. Most recent example is with Amazon, but it happens with Google, with Nvidia and the likes. Okay, so my point is that if you prepare, if you over-prepare, even if you over-invest into a phone screening round, the benefit is that if you interview good enough, if they like you, they will call you back regardless of your fit for that given role, right? So if you're not a great fit, you'll fail it fast and move on. But they will call you back for an even better opportunity, at least, a more appropriate opportunity. And oftentimes you didn't even know those opportunities aren't even made public on their jobs website, right? So this would be one scenario that I hope will be of interest to many of you. The second thing I'd like to share with you is that you should think a little bit in the context of, hey, if you pass a screening round, you don't get a job offer, you don't win any money, so to speak. So what happens is that most candidates, when they pass a screening round and get invited for a final interview, this actually represents a deadline for them. Okay, so say you get invited for a final interview round in 2 weeks. That would be a deadline of 2 weeks for you to prepare as thoroughly as possible for that interview. In my experience, the number one challenge that candidates have would be that they underestimate how long it takes to prepare for these job interviews. So when you get that deadline of 2 weeks, you might say, oh, okay, yes, I have 2 weeks, I have plenty of time, so then you start 1 week before, and then in 1 week you realize that you need more like 6 months to thoroughly prepare for that job interview. And I'm only speaking about the behavioral side here, yes? So there's people who prepare for 6 months or even 1 year for the non-technical part of these interviews with high-performing companies. So long story short, if you start early in the process to prepare and over-prepare and over-invest, so to speak, in these occasions, you'll be a lot better prepared for a final interview round. And this will bring a lot better predictability for how good you want to be for the purpose of that final interview. And there's a third scenario I'd like to share with you, which is extremely common, especially in today's job market, and especially with today's trends. That is that most candidates do not pass interviews for the first time because they don't know how to pass them. The most classic example is you preparing interviews using AI. Yes, I understand it's a trend, it's convenient, but it never works. So what happens here is that if you fail a phone screening round because you prepared using AI, in my experience, people who prepare using AI find out how bad they are when they first interview, They wouldn't take coaching and role-playing sessions, but you will find out during the phone screening round, hey, you know what, how bad you sound because you rewarded your answers using AI. So by failing your approach fast, by realizing that, hey, you're preparing the totally wrong way, you actually are in a lot better spot for your upcoming job interviews with this high-performing company, or it could be simply a matter of expectations. Many candidates don't understand how good they should be for the purpose of these job interviews. So it's also when you interview with a company, it's a matter of calibration. Okay, some people might say, hey, you know what, I worked in fintech, I speak well, and that's all that matters in these job interviews. When in reality, it's slightly different. It's a bit more about preparing a good story bank and some role play. So you would better calibrate to pass these interviews if you prep them thoroughly from the beginning. So this would be my recommendation when it comes to preparing phone screening rounds with high-performing companies, again, in the context of receiving a job offer. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.